Um, Look, I was thinking about what to say in this meeting, and I guess it's a pretty interesting and a pretty relevant topic about what makes us rise up and how do we go from anger to revolution. I think we have to start by saying that there's no shortage of reasons as to why people would want to rise up at the moment. I'm sure people have their own personal grievances or reasons about why we'd like to rise up. But I want to pick what I think are the three strongest arguments for why we need a different kind of society and why we need to rise up for it. The first has been, well, the first is really the way in which racism blights every part of capitalist society. The killing of George Floyd has been a lightning rod for the anger and the sheer fury at the racism at the heart of the capitalist system. Obviously, George Floyd's death was one person in Minneapolis, but the protests that have erupted since have shown that 50 years on from the civil rights movement, Black Americans recognize that the racism is as deeply ingrained as ever in US society. After a Black president, after Black police chief, Black mayors, still Black men face racism and face the threat of the police on a daily basis. And here in Britain, it's opened up a huge question about the institutional racism that exists in our society. I think it's now 1,600 people have been killed in Britain in police custody since 1990. But you have to go back to 1969 for the last time a police officer was charged with the death of a British person in custody in this country. The discussion around slavery, around the legacy of empire, colonialism, of institutional racism, of Islamophobia, this has erupted and it has shone a light on the racism that we face in 2020. So that's the first reason I think that many people would look for some kind of different society. I think the second reason is that in the last 6 months, we have seen the COVID crisis shine a portal or shine an X-ray onto how capitalism operates. You see this in the way that the coronavirus crisis didn't just fall from the sky. It wasn't just some kind of natural disaster. It didn't just happen as a freak occurrence. It came about because of the way that neoliberal capitalism prioritizes the pursuit of profit above all else. It is constantly searching for new markets, for new ways to exploit both people and the planet, and it creates the exact conditions in which coronavirus and pandemics can flourish. And that's what we've seen. And we've also seen that the impact of that COVID pandemic has highlighted the gross inequality at the heart of the system. Not just in the way that in places like Britain, we've seen 60,000 deaths, many of which could be unavoidable by the academic standards, by the studies, not just by ours, but by people saying these deaths could have been avoided if political decisions had been taken earlier, but also because of the economic impact. The fact that in Britain, they estimate that unemployment is hitting around 3 million and will go up rapidly when the furlough scheme comes to an end. And that if you look at the news today, Upper Crust announced 5,000 job losses, 9,000 job losses at Rolls-Royce in Derby. We know that it's been working class people and poorer people and Black people who have suffered the worst from that crisis. So the COVID crisis as a whole, I think, is a big reason why people would want to rise up. I think the third reason is that before we saw the apocalyptic scenes of pandemic, we were faced with the apocalyptic scenes of climate crisis across the world. It's a long time ago, but remember the 2020 started with wildfires in Australia, with floods in Jakarta, with the news that we have 10 years left at most to save the planet and to reverse the worst impacts of climate change. So I'm sure people will bring in other reasons into the discussion, but clearly there are a plethora of reasons as to why we need a different kind of society and an uprising to change it. Now, if that was the only political picture, if the one that I've just outlined was the only political picture, it would be a pretty bleak one in truth, of racism, of crisis, of pandemic, of climate change, and so on. But thankfully, over the last year and over the last 2 years, I think we've seen mass movements and mass uprisings, which I think offer the potential for a different kind of society and for an end to the kind of society that we've been living in. The first has been what I've mentioned, the Black Lives Matter uprising, which has been nothing short of inspirational. You have to go back to 1968 to see a movement erupt with such ferocity, such anger, and such scale. And what I think is most impressive about the Black Lives Matter movement is not just the scale of it, not just the fact that it's taken place in every part of America, in towns where, to be honest, there are hardly any Black Americans living, or in towns in Britain, towns and cities across Britain who don't have a history of anti-racist campaigns and protests. It's not just the scale of it, but it's also the impact it has had on mainstream society. I'm a football fan for my sins, and it's quite remarkable to watch a Premier League game being played between Tottenham and West Ham, two teams whose fans have a history of racism, and to see the players with Black Lives Matter on the back of their shirts, and to see the England captain taking the knee with his fist in the air, saying Black Lives Matter, to see big corporations like Nike tweeting it out, to see politicians saying they support it. Don't get me wrong, I don't think any of these people are the solution for the Black Lives Matter movement, and I don't think they will achieve much. But the fact that they feel the pressure to speak out on it speaks volumes about the scale of the movement and the impact it's had. And if my group of friends, who are a typical group of friends in North London where I live, are anything to go by, the Black Lives Matter movement has opened up a huge discussion around racism. My friends are reading Akala's books, they're sharing Black Lives Matter posts on Instagram, and they're constantly talking about it. Most of these people have never been on a protest in their life. And what the movement has done is it has given the potential, I think, it's given the feeling that there can be an anti-racist campaign in every town and city in Britain, let alone America. That wherever you are at work, in your local area, you can organise or at least start a discussion against racism. And what do we learn from the movement? We learn that protest works. That the riots, the mass protests, the taking the knee, all of those actions that have taken place in the US have done more to advance a discussion about Black Lives Matter, have done more to put the police on the back foot than years of legislation, of electing Black officials, of people speaking in Congress, and so on. So thank God for the Black Lives Matter movement that has erupted across the world in the last month. I think it's also worth recognising, though, that the Black Lives Matter movement follows, and the American uprising in particular, it follows a pattern over the last year, which is that 2019 might be a miserable year politically in terms of the general election that happened in Britain, but 2019 was a year of global revolt. America is the latest country to be added to the long list of protest movements that have shaken ruling classes across the world. The list goes from Lebanon to Iraq, to Sudan, to Algeria, to Liberia, to Catalonia, across the world, to Haiti. Protest movements involving mostly poor, mostly working class people, spread across the globe in 2019. Norman's rightly pointed out Hong Kong. The list goes on. People can add more names, more places in the chat if they'd like to. And while, of course, in each of those places, there was a unique trigger, in Chile, which I missed off the list, it was the fact that they raised the bus fares by the metro fares by 20 pesos. In Iraq, or sorry, in Algeria or and Iraq, in Lebanon, sorry, it was the implementation of attacks on WhatsApp. While there were particular triggers across all of those protest movements, there was a general theme. There was a general theme of mass protests and of generalizing that the system is the problem, and of recognizing that inequality and the system was the problem. And it's also worth adding to that list the big climate revolts we've seen over the last 2 years as well. 2 years ago, climate change, in honesty, was a political issue which socialists like ourselves treated with utmost importance, but the political elite ignored. It was bottom of the agenda. The school student strikes, Extinction Rebellion, the mass protests in the Sunrise Movement in the States, action by ordinary people has forced climate change onto the political agenda. You know, the Green New Deal, decarbonisation of the economy and so on, all of this is now being talked about, and quite rightly so. And it's because of the protest movement that erupted in 2018 and 2019. So those three examples of Black Lives Matter, of the global revolt, and of the climate movement, I think give us hope in what is a very tumultuous time under capitalism. And I think we have to recognise that while they're three separate issues, one of the features of those three revolts is the generalisation. The slogans, the organisations, the people on those protests have generalised and said that capitalism is the problem. The problem is systemic. The problem is about elites, it's about profit before people, and it's about the way that the system is run. And I guess the question we want to discuss tonight, and it'd be interesting to hear what people think. I guess the question we want to discuss tonight is, how do those revolts develop into something more substantial? How do they develop into revolution? Like I said, there's plenty of reasons why we need a revolution. How do we, in those revolts, how do those revolts develop into something which can really challenge a system that is at the heart of all the problems that I mentioned at the beginning? And if you look at revolutions in history, it seems like often a recurring two situations take place, which is that on the one hand, you have a situation where revolutionary situations come about because the majority of ordinary people can no longer live in the old way. People who for years accept or tolerate or get by with injustice, racism, poverty, and so on, suddenly there is a feeling that is enough is enough, and this can no longer go on. Crises in society, big political crises erupt, which creates huge discontent at the base of society. And to be honest, this is what I think we've seen in America in the last month or so. Because to be honest, the killing of George Floyd, tragically, is commonplace in America. The killing of black men by the police is in many ways an everyday occurrence in the United States. And partly because it was videoed, and partly because it went viral on Twitter and so on. But the killing of George Floyd, suddenly millions of people in America, both black and white, Latino and so on, felt enough was enough, felt they could not go on with that same impunity for police officers. They felt that they couldn't go on in the old way. And that has given us a glimpse of what a mass movement can look like and what a mass revolt can look like. The second characteristic, I think, that if you look at any revolutionary situation in the past and any revolution that's taken place, is that not just can ordinary people not go on in the old way, but also the people who rule society, the ruling class, also they can no longer continue in the old way. That means that the crisis created in revolts is so great that it means that within the ruling class, there are clashes. The people who run society, rather than agreeing with each other and keeping the usually uniform way in which they rule, they begin to clash it within themselves. Cracks begin to appear in what is a usually uniform ruling class. You see this with what's happened in America again. Think about the reaction to the Black Lives Matter stuff from the US ruling class. You have Trump on the one hand arguing law and order, to send in the National Guard, to ban Antifa, even though it's completely ridiculous to do so, to really send in the attack dogs. And on the other hand, you have the more liberal sections of the US establishment and almost liberal sections of the the Republican Party actually contradicting Trump and actually saying that we need to listen to these protesters, that we need to listen to their demands around the police and so on. And it's thrown up a crisis in the US ruling class about the role of the police. One of the demands of the movement has been defund, and the US ruling class are struggling with how to deal with it. You also see the crisis in the ruling class over Corona about how to deal with it. Again, Trump wants to leave the economy open, wants to let the deaths rise as high as they can. And there are other more sections, liberal sections of the ruling class, who think that they should take the action to protect lives so that the economy can continue. And it's those two things, I think, when they combine, when it's the ordinary people can't continue and the ruling class can't go on, it's when those two things, I think, can combine that you get a revolutionary situation. But I want to finish by saying that the most important thing, I think, is about the question of political power with the question of social power. Because in all those revolts that I've talked about, there is an attempt to divert the movement on the streets into what is called the political process. Look at America. The Democrats, many of the leading Black Democrats say that the riots shouldn't have happened and that it's great that people have been protesting, but now they need to stop. They need to vote Democrat, they need to follow the political process, and they need to vote for Joe Biden in November in the election. And that's where the movement should go. In other words, they try and steer a big revolt. Rather than that revolt going forward, they try and steer it to take on the political power. And I think that when revolutions have had the most impact in history is when, yes, they've challenged political power, but they have also challenged social power as well. They have challenged the social relations of society, about why it is that there's a ruling class, about why rich people govern, about the banks, the bosses, the economy, and so on. And for me, and I'll finish on this, I think that while we live in very scary times, climate change, Corona, the rise of the far right, and so on, I think the movements, especially in the last month, should give us real hope, because they offer an attempt and they offer an opportunity to put forward a different kind of politics, which is focused on mass revolt, which is focused on building roots in the working class, but quite crucially says that the system is the problem and we have to get rid of it. And we have to hope and be part of arguing that these movements shouldn't just stop short of political power, but should aim for social power as well. And I'll leave it there.